Hey everybody, today on Northern Revolutions, I'm going to talk about the difference between the Beatles' UK releases and their Canadian releases. Stay tuned. Hey vinyl community, welcome to Northern Revolutions. My name's Rob. Welcome back if you're returning. Welcome if you're new. Today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, the Beatles. Today I thought I would talk about the unique catalog that the Beatles had in Canada and how that differs from the UK. So our catalog here was different than the UK and the US, and it's similar to what was put out by Capitol Records in America, except for the first three albums. We had three that were unique to Canada. The first was Beatlemania with the Beatles. The second was Twist and Shout. And the third was Long Tall Sally. After the release of those three albums, we fell in line with the US. So why? What happened? Well, it's really a story of two men. Dave Dexter Jr., who was the head of A&R for Capitol Records in the United States, and Paul White, who was the singles and promotion manager and eventually the A&R manager for Capitol Records in Canada. Now, when the first few singles that the Beatles had recorded were sent over to North America, Dave Dexter Jr. in the United States passed on them. He was a jazz man, didn't have a lot of interest in the Beatles, didn't think they would sell. Paul White, on the other hand, in Canada, liked what he heard with Love Me Do. He issued Love Me Do, it was a flop. He issued Please Please Me, was a flop, not quite as bad. Issued From Me to You, did a little bit better. And then finally issued She Loves You, and it started climbing the charts. She Loves You would ultimately go on to reach number one in Canada in December of '63. But as it was starting to become successful in the fall of '63, Paul White took a chance and decided to issue a full-length album. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But because he had faith in the Beatles, we in Canada were the benefactors of the first Beatles album in North America, and three albums that were uniquely ours before we fell march and step in with the United States. And I'm going to get into all of that in a few minutes. But before I do, if you could do me a favor and hit that like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate it. Don't forget that bell notification. Really appreciate your support. Thank you very much. So let's take a look at the albums, album by album, to see where Capitol Records came up with the tracks for those albums and see how they compared to what was put out in the UK. So the first album, which was released in November of 1963, was Beatlemania with the Beatles. Now this album was exclusive to Canada, as Capitol Records in the US had decided to not yet release a Beatles album. So our first record came out in November of '63, about a week after With the Beatles came out in the UK. And Paul White, anticipating that that record was going to be successful, given that She Loves You was rapidly climbing to the top of the Canadian charts, ordered the master tapes from EMI in London and was sent the mono masters, the same that the UK album was pressed with, and the artwork as well. Now, what you will notice about the album is that the artwork on the Canadian album is slightly different. You got to remember that in the UK, this was the Beatles' second album. Please Please Me had been released previously. In Canada, this was their first album, and they weren't as well known in Canada as they were in the UK. So Paul White modified the cover slightly to sort of hype the band up a little bit more and maybe promote them to fans that hadn't heard of them before. So they called it Beatlemania with the Beatles, because Beatlemania, that name, as it had been coined in the media, was starting to gain some steam. Got to remember, this is a couple months out from their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. So word was getting out about who the Beatles were. So Paul White used that name, Beatlemania with the Beatles. And the other way that he changed the artwork was to add, you can see down in the bottom corner, a bunch of quotes from reporters, just sort of hype statements, if you will. So if you look at the track listing of the Canadian album, it looks exactly the same as the UK album. And that's because it was. He decided to issue it track for track the same as it was in the UK. So in Canada, the second album to be released was Twist and Shout. Now, Paul White had the advantage that he had access to the Please Please Me album, which had not yet been released in North America, but Dave Dexter Jr. in the US did not, as he had already refused to release that album. The rights had been given to VJ, a small label in Chicago, and they'd put that album under the name of Introducing the Beatles. There was some legal wranglings. Essentially, they had a year or 10 months to do what they wanted with it before the rights reverted back to Capital EMI. So that was off limits for the time being for the United States, but it was not so for Canada. So Paul White decided to release it, again, slightly altered though. We called it Twist and Shout. As you can see the artwork up here, and there's the track listing. So there are a couple tracks missing off of here. The lead track, I Saw Her Standing There, and the second track, Misery, have been omitted. And instead, as you can see, they were replaced with She Loves You, which was the single that had just topped the charts in Canada, and From Me to You. And that comprised the track listing of the Canadian Twist and Shout, an album that was only released here. The third album to be released by Capitol Records of Canada was Long Tall Sally. Now looking at it, you may think it looks a lot like the Beatles' second album in the US. And you're sort of right, sort of not right. Visually, they look the same. They use the same artwork. They use the same fonts for the title. But in Canada, we weren't going to call it the Beatles' second album, because in Canada, this was the third Beatles record. The other thing that's different is the track listing is a little bit different. I'm not going to compare the Canadian and American, but about half the album is different because we had already released some stuff that America had not. But as you can see from the Canadian track listing, it pulls from a few sources. So first off, you can see that the two tracks from Please Please Me that were omitted from Twist and Shout, I Saw Her Standing There in Misery, are included in this album. That's followed by 4 tracks from With the Beatles. Then you've got the single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and its B-side, This Boy. Then you've got the B-side of She Loves You, which is I'll Get You. Then in the UK, the Beatles had released an EP called Long Tall Sally. And from that EP, we pulled Long Tall Sally and I Call Your Name. And then rounding out the album, you've got the B-side for the single Can't Buy Me Love, which is You Can't Do That. And those are the tracks that comprised the Canadian version, Long Tall Sally, which is somewhat different than the American second album. If you want to see a comparison of Long Tall Sally and I'll call it its cousin, check out the video that Andrew's done on Parlogram Auctions. I'll leave a link in the description. He does a fantastic breakdown of the difference between these two similar looking albums, but albums that are quite different. From this point on, the Canadian catalog now is synchronized with the American catalog. Now what happened is Alan Livingston, who was the president of Capitol Records of America, who was the boss of Paul White from Capitol Records of Canada, because you have to understand Capitol Canada was a subsidiary of Capitol America. He, for various reasons, was not impressed with the way that the Beatles catalog had been handled in Canada. The directive was handed down from Capitol in the United States that going forward, all Canadian releases must be the same as America, and they must have the same artwork. So that's what happens going forward. But before we have our first synchronized Capitol album, we have Hard Day's Night to deal with. Now, Hard Day's Night in North America is not even close to the same as Hard Day's Night in the United Kingdom. First of all, as you can see, our cover's red and has 4 pictures on it. Looks a lot different. It's a soundtrack album, whereas the UK album was a studio album. Now, the way that it transpired is United Artists approached Brian Epstein, who was the Beatles manager, and offered to produce the Hard Day's Night film if they could get the rights to the soundtrack, to which Brian agreed. And so everything that appears on the North American soundtrack, which was released on United Artists, was only stuff that appeared in the movie. So you have the first half of the studio albums and then some instrumental tracks that are from the movie. If you look at the UK album, obviously it looks a lot different and it has twice the number of songs on it. Now, initially, EMI and subsidiaries in North America Capitol were not pleased that EMI had allowed United Artists to release a soundtrack album. But when they realized that they got to have the second half of the Hard Day's Night studio album to do something with, I guess they were okay. Which brings us to the next album. So the Hard Day's Night soundtrack was released in June of 1964. The Capitol answer to that was called Something New, which was released in July of 1964. And you can see there, it's all of the remaining tracks from the UK album, from If I Fell down to When I Get Home, basically the second side of the album. And to round out the album, the two remaining tracks from the Long Tall Sally EP that came out in England, so that was Slow Down and Matchbox. And then, for some reason, they decided to include the German version of I Want to Hold Your Hand. Now, the Beatles had recorded two songs in German, I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. The easiest place to find those is on the Past Masters album, but that didn't come out until the 80s. So, interesting filler track. I don't know that there was ever a great demand for it, and She Loves You, the German version, was never released in an album ever until Past Masters on CD in the 80s. So the German I Want to Hold Your Hand is included on Something New. The next album to be released by Capitol in North America was Beatles 65, which was actually released in 1964. December, to be precise. On the 4th of December, 1964, Parlophone in England released The Beatles for Sale. And 2 weeks later, Capitol in Canada and Capitol in the US issued their next Beatles album, which they called Beatles 65. Now, as I mentioned before, their formula was to take the 14 tracks that are on a UK album and pare that down to 11 tracks, which was the standard on a North American album, and then the remaining tracks would be used for filler. So what they did to compile Beatles 65 was they took 8 tracks off of Beatles for Sale, and those became the main 8 tracks off of Beatles 65. Then they took I'll Be Back, which was the last remaining track from Hard Day's Night, and the single I Feel Fine and its B-side She's a Woman, and there's the North American Beatles 65. The next album, called Beatles 6, was released in June of 1965. Funny thing, in Canada, it was not the Beatles' 6th album. It was the 7th, because bear in mind, we were able to release Twist and Shout, essentially the rebranded Please Please Me, which the US was not. So it was called Beatles 6 in the US because it was their 6th album, but in Canada it was the 7th. But because of the directive from Alan Livingston, it had to be the same as the US. So the 7th album in Canada is called Beatles 6. As you can see, it's the rest of Beatles for Sale, along with 3 tracks from the upcoming Help album. Now, Help hadn't been released yet. They were still recording it. But Capitol Records in the US contacted London and said, we need a few more songs. So they gave them a couple tracks, 3 to be precise, that they had already finished for Help. And that was You Like Me Too Much, Tell Me What You See, and Dizzy Miss Lizzie. They still needed 2 more tracks to round out this album. They pulled the B-side from Ticket to Ride, which is called Yes It Is. And they asked the Beatles to record a song specifically for the American market, which they did. It was a cover of Bad Boy. That song was never released in the UK until the Past Masters CDs in the 1980s. The only place you could find it was on Beatles 6. Interesting trivia, that's the only song where that's the case. Help was released on the 9th of August 1965. And as you can see, they look dramatically different. And they are dramatically different content-wise. So following the model of Hard Day's Night, Capitol issued a soundtrack for the movie Help. And that's what we got in North America, was a soundtrack record. So it's not the same as the studio album that was released in the UK with the full 14 songs. So what it is half a dozen songs that appear on the studio album that are in the film, and then some instrumental numbers. The cover also looks a lot different. It's a gatefold cover. It's truly a soundtrack album, whereas the UK, it's a studio album. So as you can see, you get the first half of the album from the UK on the North American soundtrack album, which was fine by Capitol because they could take that second half of the record and stretch it out into another album. Released in December of 65, we get Rubber Soul. Now, it may look like the North American Rubber Soul is the same as the UK Rubber Soul. It is not. While the covers are similar, the North American one is much darker, and they changed the title from orange to brown. Why? I don't know. The track listing has changed, though. Instead of Drive My Car, the album opens with I've Just Seen a Face from Help. And the second side starts with It's Only Love instead of What Goes On. And also Nowhere Man is missing from the album. I think it makes it a little less of a creative album than it was. I mean, this was the start of the Beatles' transition away from the Fab Four mop top into the really sort of more interesting experimental stuff. And I think the substitution of those tracks tries to prolong that traditional Beatles sound, I think, and takes away a little bit of the new direction that they were heading. I don't know that that's the logic for doing that. That's just my opinion. In June of 1966, we get what is arguably the most interesting North American Beatles release, Yesterday and Today. What's interesting about it? Not necessarily the music itself. I mean, this is the album with the infamous Butcher cover. Originally, the artwork, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, the Beatles were dressed up in butcher coats and were covered in raw meat and decapitated dolls. I read that was sort of John's social comment on how Capitol was butchering their records in North America. Don't know if that's true, but that's what I read. Needless to say, that cover was recalled before it was released. And the cover that we all know, that you see up there, was replaced. There are butcher covers out there. I'll throw up a picture here so you can see what it looks like. Those are pretty scarce, to say the least. Aside from the interesting cover, I mean, Yesterday and Today is essentially a collection of leftovers. And I don't say that to trivialize the songs that they weren't good songs. It was just what Capitol had lying around that hadn't been issued yet. So you get Drive My Car, Nowhere Man, What Goes On, and If I Needed Someone from Rubber Soul. You get Act Naturally and Yesterday, 2 songs from Help. You get 3 songs from the upcoming as yet to be released Revolver. So you get I'm Only Sleeping, Dr. Robert, and Your Bird Can Sing. Again, this is one of those instances where Capitol US phoned up EMI and said, you got anything done for the next record? We need a couple tracks. And this is what they were sent. And then to round out the album is the 2 songs from the double A side, Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. And that's Yesterday and Today. Released on the 9th of December 1966, a week after the UK album was released, we have the Canadian and American versions of Rubber Soul. They look very similar to the UK. I mean, the cover's the same, except the Parlophone label has been replaced with the Capitol Records logo. The track listing is different on the Canadian and US versions of the album from the UK. I'm Only Sleeping, and Your Bird Can Sing, and I Want to Tell You have been left off this album. Sort of standard practice in the UK for their albums to be 14 tracks. where it was generally 11 tracks in North America. Now we get to Sgt. Pepper, and this was the first time in the Beatles recording history that the albums are the same. From this point on, what was released in the UK was what would be released in Canada and the US. For one minor difference. The difference being, though, that the UK release has a sort of 2-second sound collage in the trail off strip on side B of Sgt. Pepper, which we don't have in North America, and we wouldn't get to experience until the CD in the late 1980s. So the next one I want to talk about that's different in Canada than is different in the UK is the Magical Mystery Tour. Now, this is an interesting album to talk about because it was released by Capitol in the United States and Canada as a full-length album. That is not how it was released in the United Kingdom. Originally, it was an EP, and as an EP, it had Magical Mystery Tour, Your Mother Should Know, I Am the Walrus, Fool on the Hill, Flying, and Blue Jay Way. That's half an album. But EPs were not as popular in North America as they were in the UK. So Capitol wanted a full album. They had some songs left over from singles that were issued around the Sgt. Pepper era. So you get I Am the Walrus and Hello Goodbye, an A-side, B-side. Then you get Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, another A-side and B-side. Then you get All You Need Is Love and Baby You're a Rich Man, another A-side, B-side, and that nicely rounds out the album. What has happened since that, so it was released as an EP a week after the full-length album was released in North America. When EMI and the Beatles standardized the Beatles catalog for CD release in the 1980s, this version of Magical Mystery Tour was adopted as the standard rather than the EP, because it was a nice place to put those 6 A-sides and B-sides that are such iconic Beatles songs that weren't available on an album. So this was the one instance that I would argue that Capitol did it better than Parlophone or EMI did in the UK. So the North American version of Magical Mystery Tour became the standard and was ultimately released that way on vinyl in the UK in the 70s. But initially it was just an EP. But you can see where they got the songs to round out the North American release. The last Canadian/American release to talk about is Hey Jude, the Beatles Again, which was released in February of 1970. As you can see, it's unique artwork that hadn't appeared anywhere on any UK releases. And these were essentially a collection of leftovers. Again, not to trivialize what those songs were. They were just songs that EMI or that Capitol still had and hadn't done anything with. So Can't Buy Me Love and I Should Have Known Better from Hard Day's Night. Not sure why they were included, previously released. Then you get Paperback Writer and Rain, which was a single. Then you get Lady Madonna, which was the A-side of a single. Hey Jude and Revolution. Don't Let Me Down, which was the B-side of Get Back. And then Old Brown Shoe and the Ballad of John and Yoko. So the last few singles appear on this singles collection, I guess, what you would call the Hey Jude record. And that's the last Canadian, North American Beatles release that is different than the UK. There's one other thing that I should mention. When Alan Livingston, the president of Capitol Records in America, instructed Alan White in Canada that all Canadian Beatles releases going forward must match the US catalog, one of the conditions that he imposed as well is that Capitol Records of Canada would retroactively release the first 3 US Beatles albums. So in 67 and 68, we got them. So Meet the Beatles, the first US album, came out in 1967 in Canada. The Beatles' second album came out in 1967 in Canada. Remember the one that looks oddly like Long Tall Sally, but it's not quite the same? This is it. And the last one, the early Beatles, which came out in 1968, which was the third US album. So there you have it, folks. There's a look at the Canadian Beatles catalog, how it had its own unique roots, how it was initially a little similar to the UK, and then became a carbon copy of what was put out by Capitol Records in America. In case you've always wondered, like I have, where all the different songs came from to make up the albums that we have seen in North America, I hope I've offered some insight as to how they put the pieces together. So let me know what you think. Have you heard any of the Canadian albums? Do you prefer the North American albums over the UK releases? I'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts. So that's all I have today. I hope you found it a little bit entertaining, a little bit informative. I will see everybody again real soon. Catch you on the flip side.